They expelled the woman from the club, not knowing she was the Mafia boss's wife. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of the Crimson Rose Club, Chicago's most exclusive establishment for the city's elite. Inside, the warm glow of crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished mahogany walls, while the soft melody of a jazz quartet filled the air with sophisticated melancholy. The year was 1924, and Prohibition had turned speakeasies into kingdoms and bootleggers into kings. Isabella Romano sat alone at the bar, her emerald dress catching the amber light from the overhead fixtures. She nursed a gin ricky, a drink that officially didn't exist in this establishment, though everyone pretended otherwise. Her dark hair was pinned in the fashionable finger waves of the era, and her red lips curved in a subtle smile as she observed the evening's festivities. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another wealthy socialite enjoying an evening out. The trouble began when Theodore Whitmore III approached her table. Whitmore was old money. His grandfather had made millions in steel, and his father had doubled the fortune in railroads. He carried himself with the entitled swagger of a man who had never been told no, his perfectly waxed mustache twitching with barely concealed disdain. "I say, you seem to be unaccompanied this evening," Whitmore drawled, his Boston accent thick with condescension. "Perhaps you're lost. This isn't the sort of establishment for unescorted ladies." Isabella looked up from her drink, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. "I'm exactly where I belong, Mr. Whitmore." The use of his name seemed to surprise him. Around them, conversations began to quiet as other patrons sensed the tension building. The jazz quartet continued playing, but several couples had stopped dancing to watch the unfolding drama. "You know who I am?" Whitmore's chest puffed with pride. "Then you should know that I have considerable influence in this establishment. Ladies of questionable reputation aren't welcome here." Isabella's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Questionable reputation? How fascinating. And what, exactly, makes you think my reputation is questionable?" "Well," Whitmore gestured vaguely, "you're drinking alone, dressed rather provocatively, and you're clearly not from our social circle. Decent women don't frequent establishments like this without proper escorts." The maitre d', a nervous man named Pemberton, appeared at Isabella's elbow. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of anxiety as he wrung his hands. That is, madam, perhaps we could find you a more suitable arrangement." Isabella stood gracefully, her movements fluid and controlled. She was taller than most men expected, and she carried herself with a poise that commanded attention. "I see. And what exactly would constitute a suitable arrangement?" Whitmore stepped closer, emboldened by what he perceived as support from the staff. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down by the docks. More your sort of clientele, I'd imagine." A collective intake of breath swept through the nearby tables. Even in 1924 Chicago, such a public insult was considered extreme. Isabella's expression remained serene, though those who knew her well would have recognized the dangerous stillness that had settled over her features. "I see," she said quietly, setting her glass down with deliberate precision. "So you're suggesting I leave?" "I'm insisting upon it," Whitmore declared loudly enough for half the club to hear. "Pemberton, surely you don't allow just anyone to waltz in here. This woman is clearly not of our class." Pemberton's face had gone pale. As the maitre d', he knew every member of the club and their associates. He also knew exactly who Isabella Romano was, though Whitmore apparently did not. His hands trembled as he cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No need for privacy," Whitmore cut him off. "Madam, you have 5 minutes to collect your things and leave. If you refuse, I'll have you physically removed." Isabella reached into her small beaded purse and withdrew a silver cigarette case. She selected a cigarette with careful deliberation and waited as a nearby gentleman nervously offered her a light. She took a long drag, exhaled slowly, and smiled. "How generous of you to give me 5 minutes," she said. "The most people who make that mistake don't get 5 seconds. Whitmore frowned, clearly not understanding the implications of her words. "Mistake. The only mistake here is your presence in this establishment." Isabella stubbed out her cigarette in the crystal ashtray and gathered her fur stole from the back of her chair. She moved with unhurried grace, as if she had all the time in the world. The entire club had fallen silent now, even the jazz quartet having stopped mid-song. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore," she said as she adjusted her stole, "have you ever heard the name Vincent Romano?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Whitmore's features. The name was familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Around them, several club members had begun to look distinctly uncomfortable, their faces draining of color as they realized what was happening. "Romano," Whitmore repeated slowly. "Vincent Romano," Isabella continued conversationally, "controls every drop of liquor that flows into this city, every bottle of genuine Scottish whiskey, every case of French champagne, every gallon of bathtub gin. He also owns several legitimate businesses, including a rather successful import company and a construction firm that's built half the buildings in downtown Chicago." Whitmore's mouth had gone dry. The name was indeed familiar. Romano was whispered about in the same breath as names like Capone and Torrio, though he was said to be more sophisticated, more dangerous because of his apparent respectability. Isabella smiled again, and this time it was genuinely warm, though no less terrifying for its authenticity. "Vincent Romano is my husband, Mr. Whitmore, and you've just insisted that his wife leave this establishment because she's not good enough for your company." The silence in the club was deafening. Whitmore staggered backward as if he'd been struck, his face cycling through various shades of pale. Pemberton looked as though he might faint, while several other patrons had begun quietly gathering their things, clearly wanting to be anywhere else when the inevitable consequences arrived. Isabella walked toward the door with the same unhurried grace, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished marble floor. At the entrance, she paused and turned back to address the room. "I do hope you all have a pleasant evening," she said pleasantly. "I know I certainly will." The heavy doors closed behind her with a soft thud that sounded like a death knell in the absolute silence of the Crimson Rose Club. Vincent Romano stood in the window of his office on the 23rd floor of the Romano building, watching the city lights flicker to life as darkness settled over Chicago. The office itself was a testament to refined taste and considerable wealth. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, leather-bound books lined mahogany shelves, and original oil paintings hung in gilt frames. It looked more like a gentleman's study than the headquarters of one of the most powerful crime families in the Midwest. The telephone on his massive oak desk rang once. Vincent didn't move to answer it. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, would handle it. He was expecting Isabella to return from her evening at the Crimson Rose, and her absence was beginning to concern him. She had mentioned wanting to scout the establishment for a potential business acquisition. The club would make an excellent front for their more sensitive operations. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Romano, your wife is here to see you." "Send her in." Isabella entered with the fluid grace that had first captivated him 15 years ago in Little Italy. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her expression unreadable. Vincent knew that look. It meant trouble, though whether for him or someone else remained to be seen. "How was your evening, darling?" he asked, turning from the window. "Illuminating," Isabella replied, moving to the leather chair across from his desk. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap. "I was asked to leave the Crimson Rose Club." Vincent's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Dries to leave. Demanded, actually, by Theodore Whitmore III. He felt I wasn't of suitable class to frequent such an establishment." Isabella's voice remained conversational, but Vincent caught the steel underneath. "He gave me 5 minutes to collect my things before he had me physically removed." Vincent walked around his desk and sat on its edge, studying his wife's face. After 22 years of marriage, he could read her moods like weather patterns. This particular storm was going to be devastating. "And did you enlighten Mr. Whitmore about his mistake?" "Eventually, though I suspect the lesson isn't quite complete." Vincent nodded slowly. In their world, respect was currency, and disrespect was debt that demanded payment with interest. The fact that Isabella had been publicly humiliated reflected on both of them, and more importantly, on the family's reputation. Word would spread through Chicago's underworld within hours. If Vincent Romano couldn't protect his own wife from a pompous socialite, what message did that send to his rivals? "What do you want me to do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Isabella smiled, and Vincent recognized the expression from their courtship days when she'd been planning particularly elaborate pranks on her brothers. "I want you to teach Mr. Whitmore about respect." "But Vincent," she stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I want it done with style. No broken kneecaps in dark alleys. This requires finesse. What did you have in mind? Whitmore's fortune is built on steel and railroads, but his pride is built on social standing. He values his reputation above his money." Isabella turned back to face him, her eyes glittering with anticipation. "I want you to take both." Vincent was quiet for a moment, considering. Theodore Whitmore III was not just any wealthy socialite. He was connected to some of the most powerful families in Chicago, families whose money and influence stretched back generations. Moving against him would require careful planning and absolute precision. "It won't be simple," he said finally. "Whitmore's family has connections we need to consider. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for thorough." Vincent walked to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of genuine Scottish whiskey, the kind that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to Isabella. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Isabella recounted the evening's events in detail, from Whitmore's initial approach to her final warning. Vincent listened without interruption, his expression growing colder with each detail. "He called you a woman of questionable reputation," Vincent repeated when she finished, "among other things. And the staff allowed this. Pemberton tried to intervene, but weakly. He knew who I was, but didn't want to embarrass Whitmore publicly." Vincent nodded grimly. The Crimson Rose Club would also need to learn about consequences, though their lesson would be different from Whitmore's. Establishments that failed to protect the Romano family would find their supplies mysteriously interrupted, their staff mysteriously unavailable, their wealthy patrons mysteriously reluctant to return. The telephone rang, and Vincent answered it himself this time. "Romano. Boss, it's Tommy. We got word from the club. Some of the boys are asking if they should pay Mr. Whitmore a visit tonight." "No visits," Vincent said firmly. "This requires a different approach. Have Mickey and Francis come to the office tomorrow morning at 9. And Tommy, put the word out that no one touches Whitmore without my explicit permission." "Understood, boss." Vincent hung up and found Isabella watching him with approval. One of the things he loved most about her was her understanding of the business. She'd grown up in this world, the daughter of a man who'd built his fortune importing olive oil and exporting violence when necessary. "You're going to make him wait," she observed. "Fear is more effective when it has time to grow. Right now, Whitmore thinks he might have made a mistake. By tomorrow night, he'll know he made a fatal one." Isabella moved to the safe behind Vincent's desk and withdrew a thick manila folder. "I took the liberty of having Marcus research Mr. Whitmore's financial situation. His steel investments have been struggling since the war ended, and he's heavily leveraged in railroad stock." Vincent accepted the folder with raised eyebrows. His wife's foresight never ceased to amaze him. "You were planning this before tonight?" "I was planning to acquire the Crimson Rose Club. I simply didn't expect the acquisition to become personal." Isabella finished her whiskey and set the glass down. "But I have learned that personal business often yields the most satisfying results." Vincent opened the folder and scanned the financial documents inside. Marcus DeMarco, his accountant and financial strategist, had been thorough. Whitmore's empire, while impressive on the surface, was built on increasingly shaky ground. The right pressure applied at the right points could bring the entire structure tumbling down. "How long do you want this to take?" Vincent asked. "Long enough for him to understand exactly what he's lost, and why he lost it. I want Theodore Whitmore III to remember my face every day for the rest of his considerably shortened life." Vincent closed the folder and walked around the desk to take his wife in his arms. "Have I mentioned lately that you're absolutely terrifying?" Isabella smiled and kissed him softly. "Have I mentioned lately that you're absolutely perfect?" They stood together at the window, looking out at their city, a city that was about to learn, once again, that some insults carried a price that couldn't be paid in money alone. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical for Chicago in late October. Theodore Whitmore III sat in his mahogany-paneled study, staring at the Morning Tribune without reading a word. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the previous evening's events with increasing dread. The name Isabella Romano had spoken, Vincent Romano, had haunted his dreams. After his wife had departed the club, Whitmore had cornered several acquaintances, pressing them for information about the Romano family. What he'd learned had turned his blood to ice water. Vincent Romano wasn't just another bootlegger or street thug who'd gotten lucky during Prohibition. He was a businessman, a strategist, and according to whispered rumors, absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting his family's honor. The telephone rang, startling Whitmore from his brooding. His butler, Harrison, appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Whitmore, your broker is on the line. He says it's urgent." Whitmore picked up the receiver with a trembling hand. "Pembroke, what's the matter?" "Theodore, we have a problem. The steel contracts. Someone's been buying up your railroad stocks in massive blocks. The price is dropping faster than I can track it." "What? That's impossible. I own controlling interest in 3 separate lines." "Not anymore, you don't. Someone orchestrated a coordinated sell-off that started the moment the market opened. Whoever did this has serious financial backing and inside information." Whitmore felt the room spin around him. "So how much have I lost?" "Roughly 40% of your railroad portfolio in the first 2 hours of trading. And Theodore, whoever's doing this isn't finished. They're systematically targeting every stock you have significant holdings in." The line went dead. Whitmore stared at the receiver, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. 40% of his railroad investments represented nearly $2 million, money that had simply evaporated in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, across town in the Romano building, Vincent sat in a conference room with 3 of his most trusted associates. Mickey Sullivan was Irish, built like a prize fighter, and had a mind for logistics that rivaled any general's. Francis Torino was Italian, thin as a knife blade, and could make numbers dance in ways that would make mathematicians weep. Marcus DeMarco, their financial strategist, wore expensive suits and had graduated from Harvard Business School before deciding that legitimate business moved too slowly for his tastes. "Talk to me about the railroad stocks," Vincent said without preamble. Marcus consulted his notes. "We've acquired 38% of Whitmore's holdings across 3 separate lines. The coordinated sell-off this morning dropped the value by 42%, which means we bought low, and he lost high. Conservative estimate is that he's down 1.8 million as of market close. And the steel investments? Trickier. His family's steel holdings go back 3 generations, but they're vulnerable. The company's been struggling since the war ended. Too much capacity, not enough demand. They've been propping up the stock price through private investment, but if that investment suddenly dried up..." Francis leaned forward, his dark eyes glittering with anticipation. "The steel mill has a contract to supply materials for the new courthouse construction. What if that contract suddenly became complicated?" Vincent nodded approvingly. Francis understood the elegant interconnection of legitimate and illegitimate business. How complicated? Labor troubles, supply shortages, permit delays, city inspectors finding problems that need immediate attention. Nothing illegal, just thorough. Mickey cracked his knuckles, a sound like breaking bones. "What about the social angle? Boss, this guy embarrassed Mrs. Romano in front of Chicago's elite. Maybe we should remind those people where their loyalty should lie." "Already in motion," Vincent replied. "Isabella paid a visit to Mrs. Vanderbilt this morning. It seems several prominent families are suddenly reconsidering their social connections to the Whitmore family." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Whitmore's world operated on 3 foundations: money, social standing, and family reputation. Vincent intended to systematically demolish all 3, but slowly enough that Whitmore would understand exactly what was happening and why. "Timeline?" Vincent asked. Marcus flipped through several pages of calculations. "If we maintain current pressure, his liquid assets will be depleted within a month. The social pressure should start showing results within a week. Chicago's elite have short memories when it comes to friendships that might prove costly. The steel mill situation will take longer, maybe 6 weeks. But when it collapses, it'll take the family's long-term wealth with it." Vincent was quiet for a moment, considering. The plan was thorough, but something nagged at him. Theodore Whitmore III was arrogant and entitled, but he wasn't stupid. He would eventually realize what was happening and take countermeasures. "What about leverage?" he asked finally. Francis smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "Whitmore has a son at Yale, gambling debts, The boy's been playing poker with some very dangerous people and losing badly. Word is he owes nearly $50,000 to some associates of ours in Connecticut. And a daughter," Mickey added. "She's been seen around town with a jazz musician from the South Side. Not the sort of relationship Daddy would approve of, especially if certain photographs found their way to the society pages." Vincent nodded approvingly. Leverage was the foundation of all successful negotiations, and family-related leverage was the most effective of all. Nothing happens to the children without my explicit approval. They're insurance, not targets. Understood, boss. Marcus, I want hourly reports on Whitmore's financial situation. Francis, coordinate with our friends at City Hall about the steel mill inspection schedule. Mickey, have our people monitor Whitmore's movements. I want to know who he talks to, where he goes, what he's planning. The meeting broke up, but Vincent remained in the conference room, staring out at the city skyline. Chicago was a young city compared to Boston or New York, but it had an energy that older cities lacked. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost based on vision, courage, and the willingness to take risks that more conservative businessmen wouldn't consider. Theodore Whitmore III represented the old way of doing business, inherited wealth, established connections, and the assumption that money and breeding were sufficient to guarantee success. Vincent Romano represented something newer and more dangerous: earned wealth, strategic thinking, and the understanding that in a city like Chicago, respect was more valuable than gold. His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Romano, your wife is here." Isabella entered wearing a navy blue dress that managed to be both elegant and subtly intimidating. She carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. "How was your morning, darling?" Vincent asked. "Productive. I had tea with Margaret Vanderbilt, lunch with Catherine Morrison, and cocktails with the Patterson sisters. By tomorrow morning, Theodore Whitmore III will find that his social calendar has become remarkably empty." Vincent accepted the folder she offered. Inside were photographs of Whitmore's son at a poker table, clearly intoxicated, and surrounded by men who looked distinctly unsavory. There were also several candid shots of his daughter with her jazz musician, the two of them in poses that would scandalize Chicago society. "Insurance policies?" he asked. "Exactly. Though I suspect we won't need them. Theodore Whitmore is about to discover that insulting the wrong woman can cost considerably more than his pride." Vincent pulled Isabella into his arms, marveling once again at the woman he'd married. She was beautiful, intelligent, ruthless when necessary, and utterly devoted to their family. In a world where loyalty was rare and betrayal was common, Isabella Romano was his greatest asset and his most trusted partner. "Any regrets about last night?" he asked. Isabella smiled, and the expression was genuinely warm despite the coldness of their current business. "Only that I didn't get to finish my gin, Ricky. It was perfectly made. I'll make sure to mention that to the new management when we acquire the Crimson Rose Club." "When, not if. Darling," Vincent said softly. "After what they allowed to happen to you, their acquisition isn't a business decision anymore. It's a family obligation." 1 week after Isabella's expulsion from the Crimson Rose Club, Theodore Whitmore III sat in his lawyer's office, his hands shaking as he signed yet another document transferring assets to cover his mounting debts. The mahogany-paneled room that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a tomb, its expensive furnishings mocking his rapidly diminishing circumstances. "Louis Theodore, I have to ask," said his attorney, Harold Pembroke, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Do you have any idea who might be orchestrating this campaign against you? This level of coordination requires significant resources and inside knowledge of your financial structure." Whitmore's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Oh, I know exactly who's doing this. The question is whether I can do anything to stop it." The past week had been a masterclass in systematic destruction. His railroad stocks had continued their precipitous decline as mysterious sellers flooded the market with shares. The steel mill had been shut down twice for safety violations that materialized out of nowhere and required expensive modifications to resolve. Most devastating of all, Chicago's social elite had begun treating him like a pariah, canceling invitations and avoiding his family at public events. "Sir, if you know who's responsible, perhaps we can negotiate." "You don't negotiate with Vincent Romano," Whitmore interrupted. You pray he's feeling merciful, and hope your prayers are answered before he's finished with you. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Romano's influence made itself felt once again. Pembroke's secretary knocked on the door and entered with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Pembroke, there are 2 gentlemen here to see Mr. Whitmore. They say they're from the bank." Whitmore felt his stomach drop. The First National Bank of Chicago held the mortgages on both his downtown mansion and his summer estate in Lake Forest. If they were here in person rather than sending a formal notice, it meant his financial situation was worse than he'd thought. The 2 men who entered were dressed in expensive suits, but their bearing suggested backgrounds that had little to do with traditional banking. The larger of the 2, a man with graying hair and the build of a former prizefighter, introduced himself as Mr. Sullivan. His companion, thin and pale with calculating eyes, was Mr. Torino. "Mr. Whitmore," Sullivan said pleasantly, "we're here to discuss your loan obligations with First National." "I wasn't aware my loans were in default," Whitmore replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Torino opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents. "As of this morning, you're 3 payments behind on your primary residence and 2 payments behind on the Lake Forest property. The bank has asked us to discuss immediate resolution." Whitmore stared at the papers, his mind reeling. 3 payments behind. It was impossible. His secretary had assured him all mortgage payments were current. "There must be some mistake," he said weakly. "No mistake," Sullivan replied, his tone still pleasant, but with an edge of steel underneath. "Your recent financial difficulties have made the bank concerned about your ability to meet your obligations. They'd prefer to resolve this matter privately rather than through foreclosure proceedings." "What exactly are you proposing?" Torino slid another document across the polished table. "Immediate sale of both properties to a private buyer. The offer is generous. You'll walk away with enough money to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, assuming you adjust your expectations appropriately." Whitmore scanned the purchase offer, his heart sinking. The amount was roughly half of what the properties were worth, but in his current situation, he had little negotiating power. "And if I refuse, then the bank begins foreclosure proceedings tomorrow morning," Sullivan said matter-of-factly. "Public foreclosure of a Whitmore family property would make front-page news in every paper in Chicago. Your family's reputation would never recover." The implied threat was clear: public humiliation or private capitulation. Either way, Theodore Whitmore III was about to lose the homes his family had owned for 3 generations. "Who's the buyer?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The Romano Investment Company," Torino replied with a slight smile. "They specialize in acquiring distressed properties from motivated sellers." Of course they did. Vincent Romano was systematically stripping away every foundation of Whitmore's world, piece by carefully calculated piece. The man was an artist of destruction, painting his masterpiece with Theodore's ruined life. Pembroke cleared his throat nervously. "Theodore, perhaps we should discuss this privately before making any decisions." "What's to discuss?" Whitmore interrupted, reaching for a pen. "They've made it clear that refusing isn't really an option." As he signed the sales agreements, Whitmore felt each signature as a physical blow. The mansion where he'd grown up, where his father had hosted Chicago's most influential families, where 3 generations of Whitmores had built their legacy, gone. The Lake Forest estate where he'd planned to retire, where he'd envisioned his grandchildren playing in the gardens his grandmother had designed, gone. "Excellent," Sullivan said, gathering the signed documents. "The Romano Investment Company appreciates your cooperation. You have 30 days to vacate both properties." 30 days. Whitmore's voice cracked. "I need at least 60. 30 days. Torino repeated firmly. "Though Mr. Romano has authorized us to offer assistance with your relocation. There's a very nice apartment building on the north side that has immediate availability. The rent is quite reasonable." The apartment building was undoubtedly owned by another Romano company, Whitmore realized. Even his future living situation would be controlled by the man whose wife he'd insulted. The elegant trap was complete. He could live where Vincent Romano allowed him to live, on terms Vincent Romano dictated. After the bankers left, Whitmore sat in silence, staring at the copies of the documents he'd just signed. His family's wealth, built over 3 generations, had been systematically dismantled in less than 2 weeks. The speed and precision of the attack spoke to resources and planning that went far beyond simple revenge. "Theodore," Pembroke said gently, "there might still be options. If you were to approach Mr. Romano directly, perhaps offer a public apology." "Harold," Whitmore interrupted, his voice hollow with defeat, "you don't understand what I did. I didn't just insult Vincent Romano's wife. I insulted her publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way that questioned not just her character but his judgment in marrying her. In his world, that's not just disrespectful, it's a declaration of war. Surely he's a reasonable businessman. He's the most dangerous man in Chicago because he is a reasonable businessman. Everything he's done to me has been legal, methodical, and absolutely devastating. I've been destroyed by a man who never raised his voice, never made a direct threat, never even met me face to face." Whitmore stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that no longer felt like home. Chicago had been built by men like Vincent Romano, immigrants and entrepreneurs who'd carved fortunes from raw ambition and refused to be limited by social conventions or inherited prejudices. Theodore had made the fatal mistake of believing that his family name and social position made him untouchable. "What will you do now?" Pembroke asked. "I'll do what Vincent Romano expects me to do," Whitmore replied quietly. "I'll disappear. I'll move to that apartment, live quietly, and hope he considers the lesson complete. And if he doesn't?" Whitmore turned from the window, his face aged a decade in the past 2 weeks. "Then I'll learn why Theodore Whitmore III was a fool to cross Vincent Romano's wife." The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Whitmore of better times, when his name had meant something and his future had seemed secure. Now, as darkness began to settle over the city, he realized that his old life was ending, and his new one, whatever it might be, was about to begin. In a building across town, Vincent Romano stood at his office window, watching the same sunset with quiet satisfaction. The first phase of Theodore Whitmore's education was complete. Soon, it would be time for the final lesson. 3 weeks after the destruction of Theodore Whitmore III began, Isabella Romano stood in the main dining room of the Crimson Rose Club, watching contractors remove the heavy velvet curtains that had adorned the windows for the past 15 years. The club's former owners had been surprisingly eager to sell once their liquor supplies had mysteriously dried up, and their wealthy patrons had found more reliable entertainment elsewhere. "Mrs. Romano," called James Patterson, the contractor she'd hired to oversee the renovations. "We found something interesting behind the bar that you might want to see." Isabella followed him to the mahogany bar, where workmen had been removing the back mirror to install modern refrigeration equipment. Behind the glass, they'd discovered a hidden compartment containing several bottles of pre-prohibition whiskey and what appeared to be a ledger book. "Bootlegging records," Isabella observed, flipping through the leather-bound pages. "The previous owners were more enterprising than they appeared. Should we turn it over to the police?" Patterson asked. Isabella smiled and closed the ledger. "No need. These records are from before our ownership. Ancient history, as far as I'm concerned." The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now the legitimate owner of an establishment that had been operating illegally under the previous management. Vincent's acquisition of the club had been the final stroke of his campaign against Whitmore, though it served a practical purpose as well. The Crimson Rose's location and client base made it perfect for their expanding business interests. A soft knock on the main entrance drew her attention. Through the glass doors, she saw a figure she recognized immediately: Theodore Whitmore III, standing in the afternoon rain without an umbrella, his expensive coat soaked through. He looked older, somehow diminished, but his posture suggested he'd come here for a specific purpose. Isabella nodded to Patterson. "Take your men to lunch. We'll resume in an hour." Once they were alone, she unlocked the door and stepped aside to let Whitmore enter. He moved carefully, like a man who'd learned to expect traps in familiar places. "Mr. Whitmore," she said pleasantly. "This is unexpected. Mrs. Romano." He removed his hat and stood dripping on what had once been his favorite club's marble floor. "I was hoping we might speak privately." Isabella studied him for a moment. The Theodore Whitmore who demanded her expulsion 3 weeks ago had been a man of absolute certainty, convinced of his own superiority and social position. This version was humbler, more careful, clearly aware that he was standing in a world where the rules had changed fundamentally. Of course, though I should mention that the bar isn't operational during renovations. I'm not here for a drink. Isabella led him to a table near the window, the same area where he'd first approached her that fateful evening. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. You've lost everything, she observed without cruelty, simply stating fact. Everything that mattered to the man I was 3 weeks ago, Whitmore agreed. My homes, my investments, my social standing, my family's reputation. Your husband is very thorough. Vincent is a businessman. He understands that half measures create ongoing problems. Whitmore nodded slowly. I've spent the past 3 weeks trying to understand what happened. Not the mechanics, those were obvious from the beginning. But the why. Why did Vincent Romano choose to destroy me so completely over what I thought was a minor social slight? Isabella leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Tell me what you think you learned. I learned that I made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice. I assumed that because I didn't recognize you, you weren't worth recognizing. I assumed that because you were alone, you were somehow improper. I assumed that my family name and social position gave me the right to humiliate you publicly, without consequences. And what else? Whitmore was quiet for a moment, staring out at the rain-soaked street. I learned that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And I learned that in this city, Vincent Romano has earned more respect than 3 generations of Whitmores combined. Isabella nodded approvingly. That's a more sophisticated understanding than I expected from you. I'm a ruined man, Mrs. Romano, but I'm not a stupid one. Your husband didn't just destroy my fortune. He educated me about power, real power. Isabella smiled, and for the first time since she'd known of Theodore Whitmore's existence, it was genuinely warm. And what brings you here today? Surely not just to demonstrate your newfound wisdom. I came to apologize, Whitmore said simply. Not because I hope it will change anything. I understand that what's done is done, but because you deserved better treatment than I gave you, and because my behavior reflected poorly on the kind of man I thought I was. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Isabella had expected many things from Theodore Whitmore: anger, pleading, attempts at negotiation, but not genuine contrition. I accept your apology, she said after a moment. Though I suspect you didn't come here only for that. You're right. I came to ask a favor, though I have no right to expect one and nothing to offer in return. Ask. Whitmore reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, its edges worn from handling. My son received a letter yesterday from Yale. His gambling debts have come to light, and he's been asked to leave the university. My daughter's relationship with that jazz musician has become public knowledge, and she's been ostracized by her social circle. Isabella remained silent, waiting for him to continue. They're paying for my mistakes, Whitmore said quietly. Whatever consequences I deserve, they don't deserve to have their futures destroyed, because their father was an arrogant fool. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking if your husband's justice extends to the innocent. My children made their own poor choices, but they're being punished beyond proportion because someone wanted to hurt me through them. Isabella considered this. Vincent's campaign against Whitmore had been surgical in its precision, but leverage often required pressure on family members. The question was whether that pressure had served its purpose or needed to continue indefinitely. Your son's gambling debts, she said. How much does he owe? $57,000. To men who won't accept payment plans or excuses. And your daughter? She's 22 years old and in love with a musician who makes her happy. 3 weeks ago, that was considered scandalous but manageable. Now, with our family name in ruins, she's been branded as desperate and déclasse. Isabella stood and walked to the window, watching the rain create patterns on the glass. Behind her, she could hear Whitmore's breathing, carefully controlled but edged with the desperation of a man who'd learned that some losses were irreversible. Mr. Whitmore, she said without turning around, do you understand why what you did to me was so serious? I think so, but I'd appreciate your perspective. In your world, social humiliation is embarrassing but temporary. Reputations can be rebuilt, positions can be regained, money can be re-earned. In my husband's world, respect is the only currency that matters, And once it's lost, everything else becomes worthless. She turned to face him. When you publicly declared that I wasn't good enough for this establishment, you weren't just insulting me. You were announcing to everyone present that Vincent Romano had such poor judgment, that he'd married a woman of questionable character, that his power and position weren't sufficient to protect his own wife from public humiliation. Whitmore's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. I created a challenge to his authority. Exactly. And in Vincent's world, challenges to authority must be answered decisively, or they multiply. Every criminal, every rival, every ambitious subordinate watches to see how a leader responds to disrespect. Weakness invites attack. So my destruction was necessary. Your destruction was inevitable, Isabella corrected. But your children's destruction is optional. Hope flickered in Whitmore's eyes. What would it take? Isabella returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. That depends on what you're prepared to give. I have nothing left to give. You have something more valuable than money or property, Isabella said softly. Luis, you have the opportunity to publicly acknowledge your mistake and demonstrate that you understand the consequences of disrespecting the Romano family. Whitmore stared at her, processing the implications. You want me to make a public statement. I want you to make amends. Not privately, not quietly, but in a way that restores what you damaged. How? Isabella opened her purse and withdrew a small notebook, writing quickly before tearing out a page and sliding it across the table. Tomorrow evening, the Chicago Tribune is hosting their annual charity gala at the Palmer House Hotel. Vincent and I will be attending, along with most of Chicago's social and business elite. Whitmore read the note, his hands trembling slightly. Do you want me to attend? I want you to stand up in front of 500 of Chicago's most influential people and tell them exactly what you told me today, that you made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice, that you publicly humiliated a woman who deserved better treatment, that Vincent Romano has earned more respect than 3 generations of Whitmores combined. The magnitude of what she was asking hit Whitmore like a physical blow. Public acknowledgement of his mistake would be the final destruction of whatever remained of his family's social standing, but it would also be the path to protecting his children. And if I do this, your son's gambling debts will be forgiven, and he'll be allowed to complete his education at Yale. Your daughter will find that Chicago society has suddenly developed a more tolerant attitude toward unconventional relationships. And my wife? Isabella paused. She hadn't mentioned Margaret Whitmore, Theodore's wife of 25 years, who had committed no crime beyond marrying an arrogant man. Your wife will discover that several of her former friends have remembered their fondness for her company. The Whitmore name will never carry the weight it once did, but it won't be a source of shame for your children. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring at the note in his hands. And if I refuse, then your son will likely be found in an alley somewhere, and your daughter will spend the rest of her life wondering why love wasn't enough to overcome her family's reputation. The threat was delivered without emotion, simply a statement of consequences. In Vincent Romano's world, mercy was earned through submission, and protection was granted only to those who understood their place in the hierarchy. I'll do it, Whitmore said quietly. I thought you might. Isabella stood, signaling that their meeting was over. The Tribune Gala begins at 8 o'clock. The speeches start at 9:30. Don't disappoint us, Mr. Whitmore. As he walked toward the door, Isabella called after him. Theodore, he turned, surprised by her use of his first name. Wear your best suit. When Vincent Romano's authority is publicly acknowledged, it should be done with style. After he left, Isabella stood alone in the renovated club, watching the rain continue to fall on Chicago's streets. Tomorrow evening would mark the end of the Theodore Whitmore affair. But more importantly, it would demonstrate once again that in a city built on ambition and power, respect was the only currency that truly mattered. She picked up the telephone and dialed Vincent's private number. It's done, she said when he answered. Tomorrow night, Theodore Whitmore III will stand before Chicago's elite and publicly acknowledge his mistake. And his children will be protected, as promised. Sometimes mercy is the most powerful demonstration of strength. Vincent was quiet for a moment. I love you, Isabella Romano. I love you too, Vincent. Now come home. We have a gala to prepare for." As she hung up the phone, Isabella smiled. Tomorrow evening, the Crimson Rose Club would reopen under new management. Theodore Whitmore would complete his education in respect, and Chicago would be reminded once again that some women were far more dangerous than they appeared. In the end, that lesson was worth more than any apology.